If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode. In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Cardinal Crimes. Now, it's not our regularly scheduled Monday episode where we cover a cold case or do an interview, but there is so much crime-related news happening, and I wanted to bring in an extra episode to cover some of the major headlines you might be hearing about. Now, this is a different type of episode. We might make it weekly, maybe we won't. It's going to be informal, just walking through some of the news that's caught my attention. And I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts this week on either what I've covered or stories I haven't mentioned. Give me a shout out on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Patreon, wherever. Let me know what you're thinking and if there's a story I should cover next week. But let's dive in. One of the biggest cases that I know so many have been following over the last few years has been the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin on November 13th, 2022 in Moscow, Idaho. After the arrest of Brian Kohberger on December 30th, 2022, we have all been waiting for answers. Every motion that was filed, every time the trial date got moved back, it felt like every news outlet and every true crime content creator was on it, speculating on what it all meant and what was going on. Now, I'll admit I had to kind of tune out of coverage on this case for a while because it was just so much to absorb, and I was really waiting for the trial to kind of tune back in just to see what was going on. But finally, on July 2nd, 2025, Brian Kohberger pleaded guilty to 5 charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Now, this was just weeks before his trial was supposed to begin. And while this was massive news, I got the sense that many, including many family members of the victims, were not happy. I really think so many were hoping for a trial, that all of the evidence would be showcased, so we could finally get a clearer picture of what happened on November 13th in that house on King Road. Steve, the father of Kaylee, said in an interview on NBC's Today Show, quote, "Idaho has failed. They failed me. They failed my whole family. It's my daughter. It's our children. How can you say it's just when you haven't even talked to us to see what justice looks like for us?" The family said in a statement that prosecutors vaguely mentioned a possible plea deal, but they never actually sought input from the family. Now, I'm not going to go over the details of the murders. There are so many articles and podcasts and books that have covered it in detail, but I will link to some of those in the description of this episode. One of my favorite podcasts, The Consul, is doing a multi-part series where they're profiling Brian Kohberger. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for coverage on this case. But regarding the plea deal, I personally do think this was the best route. Now, I obviously don't know what the conversations were like between Kohberger and his attorneys, but during the time I worked as an investigator for our public defender's office, I sat in on many conversations with our attorneys and our clients. And if the evidence was very much against our clients, the attorneys would advise them that the best course of action would be to take a plea deal. And in the case of Brian Kohberger, the plea deal took the death penalty off the table. Now, he will serve life in prison, but he won't be executed. And this is often what defense attorneys have to consider as a win for their clients. There were multiple instances, and we didn't work with capital cases, but where a client being sentenced to life in prison if they went to trial was going to be the most likely outcome. But if they took a plea, they'd be in prison for maybe 30 or 40 years. So depending on their age, that's still the majority of their life, but the chances of them dying in prison were much less. I also think this was the best outcome because a trial would have been just a media circus. I think of the Richard Allen trial and both of Karen Reed's trials. And obviously, the trials are about their guilt or innocence, but the victims get so lost in this process. And I can't imagine what it must be like to be a family member of one of the victims and to have to go through such a huge in public trial. And honestly, the trial probably wouldn't have gotten anyone closer to understanding why he did it. We might not ever know that. I have some theories. I think some of it might have stemmed from the research he was doing in his criminology program. If you remember, it was discovered that he had created this kind of survey looking for insight on individuals' emotional states and their thoughts before, during, and after the commission of a crime. But I also think that his motivation probably stems from some sort of misogyny. It was reported in 2023 that Kohberger had been facing disciplinary action in his job as a teaching assistant with Washington State University, and this was around the time of the murders. And he was actually fired just days before his arrest. Now, he had started that position in August of 2022, but apparently within just a really short time frame, like a month or so, he was under investigation for behavioral problems and a sexist attitude towards women. He was allegedly rude to women, would treat and grade male students differently than female students, and he had a sexist attitude towards females he interacted with at the school. Just 11 days before the murders on November 2nd, Kohberger was apparently brought into a meeting with a professor to discuss an improvement plan relating to his behavior. And this included what we just talked about, his sexist attitude towards women, but also apparently he got into multiple fights with professors where he'd become, quote, belligerent. Now, so much of the focus on the Idaho 4 case has centered on the brutality of the murders and the forensic trail that led to his arrest, and is definitely something I've been interested in, don't get me wrong. But I think we've overlooked Kohberger's apparent pattern of misogynistic behavior prior to the killings, right? Misogyny isn't just inappropriate comments. It can be a seed that's planted in someone, and it can bring them down this path of dehumanizing women. It can have them start fostering resentment and feeding these violent fantasies. And that's especially true when coupled with someone being isolated, maybe experiencing social rejection, or having perceived grievances. We see this so often with people who commit violent crime. They're isolated. They feel like the world is against them. And when looking at these types of violent crimes, and we did this with cases like Aiden Fucci, who murdered Tristan Bailey, it's so important to not just focus on the morbid details of the case. We have to look at what was happening with the perpetrator beforehand. What red flags were there? What problematic behavior did we possibly miss? And look, there's so much we don't know, and we might learn this over time as more documents become unsealed. But I think that this pattern, his apparent misogynistic behavior that he was exhibiting prior to the murders, it fits into this kind of broader societal reality that many mass murderers and violent offenders have a history of expressing hatred or disdain towards women. And I really think this part of the case requires serious reflection. And that is especially true in a culture where I feel like we are so often ignoring the connection between everyday misogyny and acts of violence. Let me know what your thoughts are on this case, what you're hoping to learn. I believe a gag order was just recently lifted, so we might be getting more information out of it. Now, in other news, A new 3-part documentary series on Hulu was just released covering the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, and I have covered her case in 2 separate episodes. I will link both of them below in the description. The documentary series called Her Last Broadcast just came out, and this was around the time that marked 30 years since she was abducted, which was on June 27th, 1995. Now, I have not personally watched the series yet. I just recently moved out of the country, so my Hulu doesn't work, my HBO doesn't work, my Netflix works, but Hulu doesn't work, and that's where it's on. And so I haven't seen it yet. But from what I have read, there isn't a lot of new information that hasn't already been investigated, especially by organizations like Find Jodi, who have been extremely thorough. Find Jodi wrote on their blog that one of the top items covered in the documentary series explores a tip from Jodi's friend that led to a 2024 search of a property in Winstead, Minnesota. And apparently the friend had contacted Mason City Police after watching a 2022 episode of 2020, which was covering Jodi's case. Now, this search in Winstead, Minnesota, unfortunately didn't yield any results, but the documentary series, though, did clear up some pieces of information. And again, this is from what I'm reading on Find Jodi's blog, since I haven't watched it myself. But apparently, Sergeant Terrence Prochaska, who is the lead MCPD investigator on the case, said that there was no palm print found on Jodi's car. And this is something that's been widely reported and something I actually mentioned, I think in both episodes I've done covering Jodi's abduction. The palm print, according to Sergeant Prochaska, was actually found on a light pole nearby. And he also clarified, said there was no blood found on the palm print or anywhere else at the scene. He also put to rest rumors that the toilet seat left up in Jodi's apartment was from an officer. Now, we talked about the toilet seat when we interviewed a member of Find Jodi and just some of the reasons why it could have been left up, like maybe Jodi was cleaning, maybe she had a male friend over, maybe she was sick and put the seat up to throw up or something. And another theory was that the seat was maybe left up from an officer when they were examining the scene, which is something that has happened before. So it's not like out of the realm of possibility. But he said that the seat was up when a responding officer showed up to check on Jodi when a welfare check was called in for her the morning she was abducted. He also clarified that there was no DNA that had been obtained from the scene or her apartment, but that they had some items they planned to test for DNA. He said 2 wine glasses were observed side by side next to the sink, but that no beer cans were found in the apartment. And that is something I've seen reported a lot, that there was beer in Jodi's apartment and it wasn't a brand that she usually drank. And so everyone was wondering about that, if it was from a friend that was over. But apparently this idea that there were beer cans in her apartment was not true. Now, once again, I need to figure out how to get my Hulu working so I can watch the series, but I definitely plan to. If you have watched it, let me know what your thoughts are. And if you have any information on the abduction of Jodi Huisentruit, please contact the Mason City Police Department, and I will put that information in the description of this episode. Moving on to the last thing that we're going to cover today. On Monday, July 21st, a federal judge sentenced a former Kentucky police officer to nearly 3 years in prison for using excessive force during the 2020 raid that killed Breonna Taylor. This came after the Justice Department recommended no prison time for the defendant. Now, for a quick synopsis of what happened in this case, if you don't remember, I'm going to read from an article by Richard Apple Jr., Derek Taylor, and Nicholas Bogle Burrows from the New York Times. Shortly after midnight on March 13th, 2020, Louisville police officers executing a search warrant used a battering ram to enter the apartment of Miss Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency room technician. The police had been investigating 2 men who they believed were selling drugs out of a house that was far from Miss Taylor's home. But a judge had also signed a warrant allowing police to search Miss Taylor's residence because the police said they believed that one of the men had used her apartment to receive packages. Miss Taylor had been dating that man on and off for several years, but had recently severed ties with him, according to her family's lawyer. Miss Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, had been in bed, but got up when they heard a loud banging on the door. Mr. Walker said he and Miss Taylor both called out, asking who was at the door. Mr. Walker later told police he feared it was Miss Taylor's ex-boyfriend trying to break in. After the police broke the door off its hinges, Mr. Walker fired his gun once, striking Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly in a thigh. The police responded by firing several shots, striking Miss Taylor 5 times. Mr. Hankison shot 10 rounds blindly into the apartment. Mr. Walker told investigators that Miss Taylor coughed and struggled to breathe for at least 5 minutes after she was shot, according to the Louisville Courier-Journal. An ambulance on standby outside the apartment had been told to leave about an hour before the raid, which was counter to standard practice. As officers called an ambulance back to the scene and struggled to render aid to their colleague, Miss Taylor was not given any medical attention. It wasn't until 12:47 a.m., about 5 minutes after the shooting, that emergency personnel realized she was seriously wounded, and that was after her boyfriend called 911. "I don't know what's happening," Mr. Walker said on a recorded 911 call. "Someone kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend." Miss Taylor received no medical attention for more than 20 minutes after she was struck, the Courier-Journal reported, citing dispatch logs. The Jefferson County coroner told the Courier-Journal that Miss Taylor most likely died less than a minute after she was shot and could not have been saved. While the department had received court approval for no-knock entry, the orders were changed before the raid to knock and announce, meaning that the police had to identify themselves. The officers have said they did announce themselves, but Mr. Walker said he didn't hear anything. No drugs were found in the apartment. Now, the officer who was just sentenced to 33 months, Brett Hankison, he fired 10 shots during the raid, but his shots didn't hit Breonna Taylor. The judge, during sentencing, said she was startled that more people weren't injured in the raid from Hankison's blind shots. Now, the Justice Department had spent years prosecuting Hankison, but under the Trump administration, they abruptly changed course and they recommended no prison time. They suggested time served, which amounted to 1 day, and then 3 years of supervised probation. Now, it never ceases to amaze me how often we let police, our government, get away with killing its own citizens. Never mind the death penalty, which is a debate for another day, but just the reckless use of power by our government, how often mistakes are made, and innocent human beings being killed because of it, and there's just little to usually no accountability. Now, I don't know about the investigations into the other officers involved or if they are also facing possible prison time. They absolutely should, in my opinion. I'm glad at least one of the officers is being held accountable for being reckless, but this never should have happened in the first place. Now, because I always want there to be a takeaway, something we can work towards to prevent another innocent person from meeting the same end Breonna Taylor did, I will say this. It should not be controversial to advocate for checks on police power. It should not. This case in particular has started a lot of conversations on police warrant practices, especially no-knock warrants and forced entry raids. Having armed officers break into a home unannounced can create deadly situations, especially when innocent people are involved or are inside. Of course, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend shot at them. He thought their home was being broken into. He didn't know it was the police. We need to hold police accountable when their operations or procedures endanger lives, and we need to identify the procedures that are putting people at risk and learn from them and change them. This is like a no-brainer thing. Every job I've ever worked at, if we find that something isn't working or is like causing damage or harm to whatever our mission is, right? Like you change course, you change your operations. And in the case of police, like literal innocent human lives are at stake. Okay. Like it should not be controversial to hold police accountable and be like, hey, maybe we should change things because people are dying. It should not be controversial to want that to happen. Now, that is all I have today for covering some of the big headlines. Let me know what your thoughts are. Tag me in some of the big stories you're seeing go around. And we will maybe see you again next week to talk about some more big stories. We'll see. But thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.